What becomes of a place once every map that once remembered it has been quietly redrawn? Somewhere in a still archive behind glass that breathes its own slow, cold, ink nearly 700 years old still traces coastlines that no ship has ever found again. Islands with names, with harbours, with the unhurried confidence of things that were truly believed in. They were set down by careful hands. And then, over the long centuries, they were erased. So before the body sinks fully into this stillness, take a moment to like this video and to subscribe. But only if what unfolds here turns out to be something worth your quiet hours. And if it feels right, leave behind a small mark of where you are listening from tonight and the hour your own clock shows in the dark. The map in question is not a single object so much as a habit of looking that gripped the medieval world. In the first decades of the 14th century, in the workshops of Genoa and Venice and the island of Majorca, men bent over sheets of treated calf skin and drew the edges of the known world with a precision that still unsettles the eye. These were the Portolan charts, the sailing maps, and they did not look like the dreamlike wheels of monks. They looked almost modern. The Mediterranean curled across the vellum in lines so accurate that a navigator today could follow them and very nearly arrive. From each compass rose fine rum lines spread outward like the spokes of some vast invisible web, crossing and recrossing the sea, binding port to port in a geometry of intention. A man named Pietro Visconti, working in those years, signed and dated his charts, which almost no one had thought to do before, as though he sensed he was making something that would outlast him. And it has. His coastlines have survived 7 centuries of war, fire, neglect, and the slow chemical patience of decay, outlasting the cities whose harbours they recorded and the languages of the men who first sailed by them. The vellum has yellowed, and the gold has dulled, but the lines hold, faithful witnesses to a world that is otherwise almost entirely dissolved. Yet scattered among those exact and trustworthy shores were other things. Islands that sat alone in the open Atlantic, far from any coast, drawn with the same steady ink, given the same proper names, the same little flags and harbours and ringed walls. To the eye of the cartographer they were no less real than Sicily or Cyprus. They were copied forward, chart after chart, generation after generation, by men who had never seen them and never would, because no one ever could. They were not there, they had perhaps never been there, and still they endured on the maps far longer than many kingdoms that were. There is a particular kind of vertigo in this. One imagines that a map is a mirror held up to the world, that it simply reflects what is. But a map is also a record of what a civilization is willing to believe, and belief, once written down in a confident hand, takes on a strange immortality. The sea between Europe and the unknown West was called by the Arab geographers the Sea of Darkness, the Mare Tenebrosum, and into that darkness the cartographers poured not only their knowledge, but their hope, their fear, their inherited rumour, and their reverence for the maps that had come before them. They drew what their teachers had drawn, and so an error, or a dream, or a story half heard from a returning sailor could become a fixed point on the face of the earth, repeated for 500 years. What did it feel like to live in a world whose western edge dissolved into legend the way a shoreline dissolves into fog? The men who made these charts were not fools. They were among the most disciplined observers of their age, and the accuracy of their coastlines proves it. They measured, they corrected, they argued over the shape of a gulf or the bearing of a cape, and yet side by side with that rigour, they held places that were never to be reached, and they held them not as fantasies clearly marked apart but woven seamlessly into the true. The line between the verified and the merely inherited had not yet been drawn. Perhaps it never fully can be. Consider what survives and what does not. Kingdoms fall and their names are forgotten within a generation. But an island drawn on a chart in 1339 could be copied onto a chart in 1450, and onto a globe in 1550, and onto an admiralty map in 1750, each maker trusting the one before, until the island had a longer continuous existence on paper than most empires enjoy in stone. The phantom outlived the real. There is something almost tender in this, and something quietly frightening. The world that the medieval mind carried was not only the world that was, it was the world that had been written, and the writing had a life of its own. These charts now rest in libraries in Paris and Florence and Yale and Lisbon and Istanbul. Their colours faded to the soft umbers and rusts of dried blood and old gold. Scholars turn their pages with gloved hands and measure their distortions against satellite truth, and where the medieval line is right they nod, and where it is wrong they make a small note. But the most interesting marks are neither right nor wrong in any simple way. They are the islands that were sought and never found, the lands that appeared and then, over slow centuries, faded back into the sea of darkness from which they had been summoned. And the question that lingers, as the candle burns low over the vellum, is not only where those places went, it is how they ever came to be there at all, and whether the maps we trust tonight are entirely free of the same gentle, persistent ghosts. If the Phantom Islands troubled no one for so long, it is worth asking what kind of object a Portolan chart truly was, and how a thing could be both an instrument of survival and a vessel of dream. A sailor did not consult these charts to admire them. He used them to live. Out on the dark Mediterranean, with the coast lost behind a swell and the stars smothered by cloud, the chart and the compass were the difference between a safe harbour and a hull splintered on rocks no one would ever name. So the men who depended on these maps had no patience for decoration. The coastlines they trusted had been bought with drowned crews. Every accurate cape on the vellum was, in a sense, a memorial, the distilled knowledge of voyages that had ended badly enough to teach the survivors where the danger lay. And this is precisely why the survival of the Phantom Islands is so strange. They survived not in a frivolous medium, but in the most ruthlessly practical document the age produced. The making of such a chart was a slow inheritance. A master cartographer rarely surveyed the world himself. He copied. He took an older chart, often one passed down through a family of map makers or purchased at great cost, and he traced its lines onto fresh vellum, adjusting here, correcting there, adding what new reports the harbours had brought in. The Majorcan school, the Genoese, the Venetian, each guarded its templates the way a guild guards a secret, and the knowledge moved forward in this hand-to-hand fashion, a long chain of trust stretching back into a past whose original observations no one could any longer verify. To copy was not laziness. It was the very method of the science, but it meant that whatever entered the chain early enough, and with enough authority, would be carried forward almost regardless of whether the world agreed. There is a deep human truth buried in this practice, and it does not belong only to the Middle Ages. Knowledge, once trusted, tends to be inherited rather than re-examined. The chartmaker copying his master's island had no reason to doubt it. The master had not doubted his master, and somewhere far back, beyond memory, someone had drawn it for a reason that may have been a genuine landfall, or a mirage, or a misread report, or a sailor's tall tale told in a tavern and written down by a clerk who had no way to test it. The reason died. The line lived on, and each careful copyist, in his diligence, became an unwitting guardian of a mistake he had every reason to believe was a fact. The Portolan chart also carried within it a quiet philosophy of the sea. Around its edges, where the known faded, the cartographers did not simply leave emptiness. Emptiness was intolerable. It suggested ignorance, and a chart was a claim to mastery. So the margins filled with what was rumoured, what was hoped, what older authorities had insisted upon. The chart presented a seamless world, fully accounted for, with no visible seam between the harbour a man could sail into tomorrow, and the island that no living person had ever touched. The medieval eye was not invited to distinguish between them. The whole sheet wore the same authority, and what of the place itself, the workshop where these visions were fixed? One pictures the low light, the smell of the prepared skin, the careful grinding of pigments, the lapis blue reserved for the sea and the rivers, the gold leaf for the cities of great kings. A chart was an expensive thing, sometimes a princely commission, and its beauty was part of its claim to truth. A document so finely made, so costly, so confidently lettered, did not invite suspicion. It invited belief. There is a lesson there that has never expired, for in every age the most polished representation of the world is the one we are least inclined to question. So the Phantom Islands were not anomalies smuggled into an otherwise honest record. They were the natural product of how the record was made. The same chain of trust that preserved the true shape of the Black Sea preserved the imaginary shape of islands in the Atlantic. The same reverence for the old masters that kept navigators alive also kept the ghosts afloat. The accuracy and the illusion were not opposites. They were twins, born of the same method, fed by the same faith in what had been handed down. This raises a question that grows colder the longer one holds it. If the very reliability of these charts depended on copying, and if copying could not tell the difference between a coast and a dream, then how much of what any age regards as established geography is simply error that has not yet been caught? The medieval sailor would have laughed at the suggestion that his charts contained fictions. The fictions were precisely the parts he trusted most, because they had been there longest, drawn by the oldest and most respected hands. Authority and antiquity, the two things that made a claim feel safe, were exactly the things that protected the phantoms from scrutiny. And so the chain moved on, decade after decade, the islands riding along it like passengers no one remembered boarding. Somewhere in the Western Ocean, on sheet after sheet of darkening vellum, a round island waited off the coast of Ireland, ringed and named and patient, drawn first by a Majorcan hand and destined to outlast the man who drew it by more than 500 years. The sailors who looked for it would return empty. The cartographers who copied it would never doubt. And the question of what exactly had been seen out there in the grey Atlantic, if anything had been seen at all, would deepen with each generation that failed to find it and yet refused to let it go. The round island had a name, and the name itself seemed to promise something. Hy-Brasil, the cartographers wrote it, or Brazil, or Brasil, in a dozen drifting spellings, and it sat in the Atlantic west of Ireland, drawn most often as a near-perfect circle split by a channel through its centre, as though even its shape were too neat for the real world. It appeared on the chart of the Majorcan master Angelino Dulce in the 14th century, fully formed, fully named, and from there it began a journey across the maps of Europe that would last more than 500 years, longer than the lifespan of any phantom has any right to claim. The name had nothing to do with the country in South America that would later carry a version of it. That land was named for a dye wood, and the coincidence is only a coincidence, though a haunting one. The Atlantic Brazil came instead, most scholars think, from the Old Irish, from a word suggesting something blessed or fortunate, an isle of the other world such as Celtic legend was rich with, a place of the dead, or of the ever-living, lying somewhere beyond the western horizon where the sun goes down into the sea. The medieval mind did not draw a sharp line between such a legend and a navigational fact. If the old story said an island lay to the west, and if some returning fisherman swore he had glimpsed a dark shape low on the water at evening, then the cartographer had every reason to give it ink. What is remarkable is not that it appeared, but that it refused to leave. Generation after generation of map-makers copied it forward, adjusting its position slightly, sometimes moving it nearer the Irish coast, sometimes farther out, but never doubting that it was there. And the legend grew the way legends do when they are written down and treated as fact. The island was said to be shrouded in mist that lifted only once every 7 years, when it could briefly be seen from the shores of Ireland, a phantom coast glimmering on the edge of the visible before the fog closed over it again. Sailors set out to find it in the clear intervals and returned with nothing, and their failure somehow only strengthened the belief, for an island that hides itself is far harder to disprove than one that simply sits and waits to be reached. Expeditions went looking. In the late 15th century, ships sailed from Bristol into the Western Ocean in search of the island of Brasil, hunting in land that men of business and men of the sea took seriously enough to spend money and risk lives upon. They found open water, and still the island stayed on the charts. There are accounts, harder to verify, of a later visitor who claimed to have landed there in the 17th century, and to have met its inhabitants, returning with strange tokens and stranger stories, the kind of report that the credulous embrace and the careful set aside, but which neither could entirely kill. It is the longevity that astonishes. Long after the New World had been mapped, long after the Atlantic had been crossed and recrossed by thousands of vessels, long after the age of reason had begun to scour the old charts for superstition, the round island lingered. It was still being printed on British Admiralty charts into the 19th century, a relic of medieval faith floating among the precise soundings and tide tables of the industrial age, until at last in the 1860s it was quietly removed, not so much disproven as finally after half a millennium allowed to fade. The last appearance of Brazil on an official chart is one of the strangest dates in the history of geography, a medieval ghost surviving into the era of the steamship and the telegraph, charted alongside the very instruments that would have made its discovery, had it ever been there, a matter of routine. It had outlived not only its first witnesses but the entire world that had believed in it. What, then, had the first cartographer drawn? Some have proposed natural explanations, and they are worth holding gently, for none is certain. There are banks and shoals in those waters, places where the sea behaves strangely, where in certain conditions of light and atmosphere, a low fog or a mirage can lift the image of a distant something above the horizon, a trick the eye cannot easily refuse. The phenomenon by which distant objects are raised and distorted into apparent coastlines is well documented. Sailors in many waters have sworn to land that the next day's clear light revealed to be nothing. Perhaps the round island was such a mirage, seen once, drawn once, and then preserved forever by the faithful copyists who never thought to ask whether the original witness might have been deceived. But the deeper mystery is not optical. It is psychological, and it belongs to every age. Why does the human mind cling so fiercely to a place it cannot reach? The island west of Ireland answered a need older than cartography, the need to believe that the horizon is not the end, that beyond the known there waits something blessed, something hidden, something that will reveal itself to the worthy when the mist lifts. Each failed expedition that returned empty-handed should have weakened the belief. Instead, the believers reasoned that the mist had simply not lifted for them, that the island had withheld itself, that the fault lay in the timing or the worthiness of the seeker and not in the existence of the sought. This is the logic by which all unreachable certainties defend themselves, and it raises a question that does not stay confined to the Atlantic. How many of the things a civilization is most sure of are sustained not by evidence, but by the conviction that the evidence is merely hidden, waiting, withheld until the proper moment comes? The round island is gone from the charts, but the habit of mind that drew it has never been erased. If a single island could survive 5 centuries on faith, what of an island that carried a whole drowned history within it? An island that was not merely a place but a refuge, a relic of catastrophe, a promise that what was lost might still exist somewhere out beyond the edge of the map. Such was Antillia, the great rectangular island that the charts placed far out in the western Atlantic, larger than any of the Phantom Isles, and burdened with one of the most poignant legends ever attached to a piece of cartography. It appears in clear and confident form on a chart drawn by a Venetian named Zuane Pizzigano in the early 15th century, set down decades before any European is known to have crossed the open ocean to the lands beyond. There Antillia sits, a long shape with a notched coastline, marked with the names of 7 towns. For Antillia was also called the Isle of the 7 Cities, and the story behind that name reaches back to a real and terrible event, which is part of what gives the phantom its peculiar weight. The story held that when the Iberian Peninsula fell to the Moorish conquest in the early 8th century, when the Visigothic kingdom collapsed and the armies of Islam swept across the land, 7 Christian bishops gathered what people and treasures they could and fled westward across the sea. Beyond the horizon they found an island, and there they founded 7 cities, and there they remained, a remnant of a vanished Christian world preserved in secret far out in the ocean of darkness. It is a legend, of course. There is no island, and the bishops, if they ever existed, fled into history's silence rather than to any western shore. But notice the structure of the story, for it is the same structure that recurs again and again in the geography of phantom lands. A real catastrophe, the actual conquest of Iberia, an event of immense and traumatic reality, is answered by an imagined survival. What was destroyed at home is preserved abroad, hidden, intact, waiting. The map becomes a place to store grief. The unreachable island becomes the keeper of everything the known world has lost. And because the loss was real, the island felt real too, charged with the emotional truth of the catastrophe it claimed to have escaped. A people that cannot accept the finality of its defeat will build, somewhere beyond the edge of the verifiable, a refuge where the defeat did not occur, and it will furnish that refuge with the names of its lost cities and the faces of its lost dead, and it will defend the existence of that refuge with a fervour that no mere geography could ever inspire. Antillia did more than haunt the maps, it shaped history. When navigators of the 15th century began to think seriously about sailing west, the island gave them a destination, a stepping stone, a reason to believe the crossing was shorter and safer than it was. It is woven into the speculative geography that helped persuade men that something solid lay out there to be reached. The great westward voyage that finally crossed the Atlantic was undertaken by a man steeped in exactly this body of belief, who carried with him the conviction that islands and even Asia lay nearer than they did, and who expected to find populated lands where the charts had long promised them. When he and those who followed did find lands across the sea, the name itself migrated. The islands of the Caribbean came to be called the Antilles, a faint linguistic echo of the phantom that had drawn ships westward in the first place. The ghost island, in a sense, had pointed the way to real ones, though not the ones it had promised, and not in the way anyone intended. Here is something worth sitting with in the quiet. The phantom was wrong, and yet it was, in its crooked fashion, productive. The belief in Antillia was a belief in something false, but it pushed real ships into real waters and contributed to a real and world-altering crossing. The error was not inert, it was an engine. And this complicates the easy notion that false beliefs are simply obstacles to be cleared away. Sometimes a civilization moves forward, propelled by exactly the things it is most wrong about, reaching a true destination by the light of a false star. The men who sailed west toward the 7 cities did not find the 7 cities. They found something else entirely, something that would reshape the world. But they might not have sailed at all without the phantom to call them. The deeper one looks at Antillia, the more it resembles a vessel for memory rather than a record of land. Its 7 cities were the cities that had been lost. Its distant safety was the safety that the conquered longed for. Its very existence on the map was a refusal to accept that what had been destroyed was truly gone. And in that refusal there is something both noble and self-deceiving. The same impulse that builds shrines to vanished kingdoms and tells children that the old world still survives somewhere beyond reach. The map did not lie out of carelessness. It lied out of need, and so the question turns once more, as it must. If a map can hold a place that exists only because a people could not bear to let their losses be final, then what is a map truly? Is it a description of the world as it is, or a confession of the world as the mapmaker wished it to be? The bishops never sailed to Antillia, but the island they were said to have founded outlived their conquerors on the charts of Europe. A kingdom of grief floating in the western sea, real enough to launch the voyages that would remake the earth, and false enough to vanish the moment those voyages revealed what was actually there. There was another island that the searchers could never pin down, and its elusiveness was not a flaw in the legend but its very heart, for this was an island that was said to move. St. Brendan's Isle, the cartographers called it After the Irish monk whose voyage into the Western Ocean became one of the most beloved and widely copied tales of the medieval world, the account of that voyage, written down centuries after the saint himself was supposed to have lived, told of Brendan and a company of monks setting out in a hideboat across the Atlantic in search of the promised land of the saints, and of the wonders they met along the way. A sea of crystal, a column of clear stone rising from the water, an island of birds that sang the divine offices, a region of perpetual flame, and at last a blessed land of light beyond a wall of fog. To modern ears, the tale sounds like pure marvel, and much of it surely is. Yet it travelled through medieval Europe not as idle fantasy, but as something closer to testimony, copied and recopied in monasteries from Ireland to Italy, translated into many tongues, treated with the seriousness that an age reserves for the accounts of holy men. And because it was believed, the island found its way onto the maps. There it sat in the western Atlantic, sometimes near the legendary Brazil, sometimes farther south toward the islands that did exist. A saint's paradise given coordinates, a story converted into geography. What makes St. Brendan's Isle so revealing among the phantom lands is the way it behaved when men went looking for it. They did go looking. From the Canary Islands, which were real and inhabited and within sight, sailors and officials reported seeing, on certain clear days, a further land to the west, low and blue on the horizon that no ship could ever reach. Expeditions set out toward it across the centuries, not in the credulous early Middle Ages alone, but well into the era of careful navigation, even after the surrounding seas had been thoroughly charted. And each time the island withdrew, the searchers sailed to where it had appeared and found only water and the curve of the empty sea, and when they turned back, there, sometimes it would be again, hanging on the horizon as if mocking the effort to approach. The natural explanation is almost certainly atmospheric, the same family of optical effects that may have raised the round island off Ireland. From the high volcanic peaks of the Canaries, under the right conditions of temperature and light, distant land masses can be lifted and projected above the true horizon, appearing as coastlines where there is open sea. The blue land that the islanders saw may have been a real island warped and displaced by the trembling air, a mirage of something that existed elsewhere, refusing to stay still because it was never truly where it seemed to be. The mind, presented with a coast it could see but never reach, did what minds do. It named the coast, and it explained the failure to reach it as the island's own will. The land was not absent. The land was hiding, and yet to reduce St. Brendan's Isle entirely to a trick of light is to miss the more interesting current beneath it. The medieval imagination did not separate the physical sea from the spiritual one. The voyage of Brendan was a pilgrimage as much as an exploration, and the promised land of the saints he sought was not merely real estate, but the threshold of the eternal, the place where the world thins and the divine shows through. When such a land was placed on a map, it carried that double meaning with it. The cartographer who drew the Saints' Island was not only recording a rumoured coast, he was acknowledging that the Western Ocean, the great unknown beyond the edge of the inhabited world, was a place where the boundary between the physical and the sacred grew uncertain. The map of the Atlantic was in part a map of the afterlife. This is why the island moved. A holy place that anyone could reach by ordinary sailing would not be holy. It would be merely far. The withdrawing island preserved its sanctity by remaining unreachable, granting glimpses to the worthy and the patient while refusing possession to all. The same logic that protected the round island of Brazil protected Brendan's paradise, but here the logic was explicitly spiritual, and so even harder to argue against. To fail to find the island was not to disprove it. It was to be found wanting. The persistence is its own quiet astonishment. St. Brendan's Isle remained on serious maps for centuries, and Spanish authorities in the Canaries were still, in relatively modern times, taking testimony from people who swore they had seen the phantom land to the west. Sober officials recorded the sightings of fishermen and shepherds, men who had no reason to lie and every reason to believe their own eyes, and the weight of all that honest testimony kept the island alive long after reason should have dissolved it. For how does one argue with a crowd of witnesses, each sincere, each certain, each describing the same low blue coast on the same clear afternoons? And so a question rises out of the fog where the Saints' Island waited. When many honest people see the same thing, and that thing cannot be reached, what is the more rational conclusion? That they are all deceived in the same way, or that something is there which simply will not let itself be touched? The medieval and the modern mind answer differently, and the difference marks a boundary in the history of human thought. But the island itself never cared which way the question was answered. It rose, it hovered, it withdrew, and one by one the men who had seen it died, taking their certainty with them, while the next generation looked west on the next clear day and saw once more a land that was not there. Beyond the western islands lay something stranger than any phantom coast, the edge itself, the place where the map ran out and the cartographer was forced to decide what to do with the nothing that remained. To the far north, past the last reliable reports, lay a name older than the Portolan charts, older than the medieval world, a name that the ancient Greeks had carried back from the cold limit of their voyaging, Thule, the land at the end of the earth. It came from the account of a navigator from the Greek colony of Massalia, who sailed north from Britain in the 4th century before the Common Era, and reported 6 days' sail beyond it, a land where the sun barely set in summer, where the sea, the air, and the land seemed to merge into a single substance that was neither wholly liquid nor wholly solid, like a vast lung of the world through which a ship could no longer pass. The ancients argued about whether to believe him. Some called him a liar, for the things he described lay beyond their experience and therefore in their judgment beyond possibility. Others took him seriously, and Thule entered the geographical canon as the northernmost place, the edge of the inhabitable, the phrase Ultima Thule coming to mean the farthest reach of any endeavour, the limit past which nothing lay but mystery. Whether the navigator had reached Iceland or the coast of Norway, or some other northern shore, the scholars still debate, but the point that matters here is what Thule became once it was set down. Not a destination, but a boundary, the name for the place where knowledge surrendered to the unknown. Every map must end somewhere, and the manner of its ending tells a great deal about the people who made it. The medieval cartographer faced a terrible blankness at the margins of his world, and blankness was not acceptable. To leave the edge empty was to confess ignorance, and worse, to invite the suspicion that the chart was incomplete, untrustworthy, a failure of mastery. So the edges were filled, sometimes with the names inherited from antiquity, like Thule, sometimes with the monstrous and the marvellous, sometimes with warnings. On certain globes and charts of the period when the edge of the known was being violently pushed outward, there appear words that have become legendary in their own right, a Latin phrase placed along the rim of the unexplored that has been understood to mean that there, in the unmapped beyond, dwell dragons. The phrase is rarer than popular memory imagines, found in only a scarce instance or two among the surviving globes, but its survival in the imagination is itself telling. It is the perfect emblem of how the human mind treats the boundary of its knowledge. Where understanding ends, the imagination does not leave a void. It populates the void with what it fears, and sometimes with what it secretly hopes. For the unknown has always been a screen onto which the mind projects the contents of its own depths. There is a profound honesty in this dishonesty. The cartographer who wrote of dragons at the edge was not lying so much as confessing. He was admitting, in the only language available to him, that he did not know what lay beyond, and that what one does not know is to be approached with dread as much as desire. The dragons were a way of marking the limit of the verifiable, while refusing to leave it merely blank. They were the medieval equivalent of every later age's instinct to fill its ignorance with its anxieties, to imagine the unexplored as more dangerous, more wonderful, more charged with meaning than the dull truth would eventually prove. And Thule, the cold edge, drifted across the maps for centuries never quite fixed, moving northward as the actual north was explored, always retreating just beyond the last verified shore. This is the behaviour of a boundary rather than a place. As the known world expanded, Thule did not get discovered and settled and made ordinary. It receded. It remained always the land beyond the last land because that was its function, to mark the edge, wherever the edge happened to be. When ships reached Iceland, Thule moved past Iceland. When they reached the far north, Thule moved past that. The phantom of the edge cannot be reached, because reaching it would destroy its purpose, and so it withdraws forever, a horizon wearing the costume of an island. What does it mean to live with a map whose edges are guarded by dread, and whose farthest land is forever just out of reach? It means living with the constant quiet awareness that the world is larger than one's knowledge of it, that beyond every charted coast there waits an uncharted one, and beyond that the place where the sea curdles and the air thickens and the map simply stop. The ancients felt this, and the medievals felt it, and though the modern world likes to believe it has banished the blank margins forever, it is worth wondering whether that confidence is earned or merely assumed. The maps are full now, the satellites have photographed every coast, and yet the deep sea remains less explored than the surface of the moon, and the places where the data thins are still in their way, the dwelling of dragons, not the scaled beasts of legend, but the same old presence that has always lived at the edge of the known, the unknown itself, patient, vast, and indifferent to the confidence of those who draw the maps. The edge of the medieval world was a frightened guess dressed in beautiful ink, and the question that follows the listener into the dark is whether the edges of the present world are anything more than the same guess, drawn with finer instruments, but resting at last on the same uneasy faith that what cannot be seen has nonetheless been correctly imagined. The Portolan charts were the practical face of medieval geography, but they were not the only kind of map the age produced. And to understand how lands that never existed could feel so utterly real, one must look at the other tradition, the great wheel-shaped maps of the world that hung in cathedrals and adorned the manuscripts of monasteries, the Mapae Mundi, which were never meant to guide a ship at all. The largest and most famous of these to survive hang still in an English cathedral, drawn on a single sheet of calfskin around the year 1300, more than 7 centuries ago, and to look upon it is to enter a world that no longer exists in any sense, a world organised not by coastline and distance, but by faith, memory and meaning. On this map, east is at the top, not north, because east was the direction of sunrise and of Eden, and the whole image is oriented toward the sacred rather than the magnetic. At the very top, beyond the inhabited lands, sits the earthly paradise, the garden from which humanity was expelled, drawn as a real and locatable place, an island ringed by fire or water, containing the figures of the first man and woman and the tree of their fall. Below it the known continents spread in their medieval arrangement, with Jerusalem placed at the very centre of the world, the navel of the earth, because in the theology of the map-makers, the holy city was the spiritual centre of all creation and therefore must be its geographical centre too. The map was an argument about the meaning of the world, and the meaning came first. The geography was bent to serve it. Scattered across its surface are the creatures and peoples that the ancient authorities had described and that the medieval mind faithfully preserved. Races of men with faces in their chests or with a single great foot, they raised to shade themselves from the sun, or with the heads of dogs. Tribes that subsisted on strange diets. Men who lived in impossible ways at the edges of the world. These were not invented by the map-maker for amusement. They were inherited, copied from the encyclopedias of late antiquity, which had themselves copied them from older sources, the whole chain of transmission lending them an authority that no single observer could have provided. The monstrous races existed on the map for the same reason the Phantom Islands existed on the charts. Because the old authorities had recorded them, and to omit them would have been to claim a knowledge greater than that of the revered ancients, a presumption no humble copyist would dare. It is tempting to look at such a map and see only superstition, a charming relic of an age that did not know better. But that is too easy, and it misses the more unsettling truth. The makers of these maps were not ignorant of the practical geography of their own world. The same monasteries that produced theological world maps also possessed the accurate sailing charts. The two coexisted, serving different purposes, and no one found the contradiction troubling. The world map was true in the way a stained glass window is true, not as a measurement but as a meaning, an image of how all things stood in relation to the divine. The Garden of Eden was on the map because it was real to the medieval mind, not necessarily reachable by ship, but real in the order of being, a place that existed even if no living person could go there. And this is where the phantom lands and the theological maps begin to illuminate each other. Both traditions placed on the map things that could not be reached. Both treated the unreachable as no less real than the reachable. The difference was only in the kind of truth being claimed. The Portolan chart claimed that its phantom islands could in principle be sailed to, and was slowly, painfully corrected as ship after ship failed to find them. But the world map made no such claim about paradise. It asserted a truth of a different order, one that no failed voyage could ever disprove, because no one expected to sail to Eden in the first place. The garden was safe from refutation precisely because it had stepped outside the reach of evidence. There is a strange wisdom hidden in this, and a strange danger too. To place a belief beyond the reach of evidence is to make it permanent, immune to the corrections that gradually erase the phantom islands from the practical charts. The round island off Ireland could be removed once enough ships had failed to find it. But how does one remove paradise from a map of meaning? It cannot be sailed to and found absent. It was never offered as a destination. And so, the things a civilization places in this protected category, the truths it declares to be of a higher order, beyond mere measurement, endure with a tenacity that the merely empirical can never match. They are the islands that no expedition can ever disprove, because they have been carefully positioned where no expedition can ever go. The cathedral map still hangs in its dim light, its colours darkened by centuries, its paradise still glowing faintly at the top of a world that no longer believes in its arrangement. And it raises a question that follows the listener out of the cathedral and into the night. Every age draws a map of meaning, as well as a map of measurement, and on the map of meaning it places the things it holds to be true beyond all testing. The medieval world placed Eden there, and the monstrous races, and the centrality of the holy city. What does the present age place there, in the protected zone beyond the reach of evidence? And in 700 years, when those certainties have darkened like old ink, will they too seem to have been phantom lands all along, beautiful, confident, and never once existing in the world that ships could actually reach? The phantom islands and the gardens of paradise share a single deeper mechanism, and it is worth following that mechanism to its source, for it explains not only the strange durability of medieval errors, but something that has never left the human habit of knowing. The mechanism is copying. A claim once made and written down with sufficient authority is rarely re-examined by those who inherit it. It is reproduced, and each reproduction lends it further weight, until the claim becomes so embedded in the record that to question it feels like questioning reality itself. Nowhere is this more starkly visible than in the long dominion of a single ancient authority over the geography of the entire Western world. In the 2nd century, in the great library city of Alexandria, a scholar compiled a work that gathered the geographical knowledge of the classical world into a single system, complete with coordinates, projections, and a method for representing the curved earth upon a flat surface. It was a monumental achievement, the high water mark of ancient geography, and it contained, alongside its genuine insights, a number of significant errors, among them a serious underestimate of the size of the earth and distortions in the shapes and positions of distant lands that the author had never seen and could only reconstruct from the reports of others. The work was lost to Western Europe for many centuries, preserved in the Islamic world and in the Greek East, and when it was at last recovered and translated, it did not arrive as one ancient opinion among many. It arrived as authority, the rediscovered wisdom of the ancients, and its errors arrived with it, wearing the same crown of antiquity as its truths. For more than 1,000 years, the shape of the world that educated Europe carried in its mind was shaped by this inheritance. The errors were not isolated mistakes to be casually corrected. They were woven into the foundational text, and to challenge them was to challenge the whole edifice of classical learning. The underestimate of the Earth's circumference, in particular, had consequences that would reach across the centuries, for it helped convince later navigators that the ocean separating Europe from the East was far narrower than it truly was, encouraging the very voyages that would stumble upon a continent no one had accounted for. The error, once again, was not inert, it steered ships. What is so instructive about this long reign of inherited mistake is that it reveals copying not as a failure of medieval intelligence, but as the ordinary structure of how knowledge moves through time. The scholars who preserved and transmitted the ancient geography were not lazy or credulous. They were performing the essential work of any literate civilization, which is to carry forward what has been learned so that each generation need not begin from nothing. But this very service contains a hidden cost. To inherit is to trust, and to trust is to suspend examination, and the things one does not examine are precisely the things that can be wrong without anyone noticing. The Phantom Islands rode the chain of copying just as the geographical errors did, and for the same reason. Because the chain was built for transmission, not for testing, and a transmission system faithfully transmits whatever enters it, true or false, with magnificent indifference. There is a particular loneliness in contemplating this. It means that no individual, however careful, can fully escape the errors woven into the knowledge of their age, because most of what any person knows was not discovered by them, but inherited, accepted on the authority of others, taken on the same trust that the medieval copyist extended to his master's chart. The modern mind likes to imagine itself as standing on solid, tested ground, but the overwhelming majority of what it holds to be true it has never personally verified and never could. For a single lifetime is far too short to re-examine the accumulated inheritance of civilization from first principles. The individual is, in this sense, always a copyist, faithfully reproducing a world picture assembled by others, hoping that those others tested what they passed along, but unable, for the most part, to check. The Phantom Islands were eventually erased, and the great geographical errors of antiquity were eventually corrected. But the correction took centuries and required the slow, painful accumulation of contradicting evidence. Failed voyages, new measurements, the stubborn refusal of the world to match the map. And even then the correction did not come from doubting the inheritance in the abstract. It came from the friction between the inherited picture and the observed reality. The moments when a ship sailed to where an island should have been and found only sea, when the actual distance proved far greater than the texts allowed. Reality, in the end, is the only thing that can correct a copy, and reality corrects slowly, one stubborn contradiction at a time, against the enormous inertia of everything that has been confidently written down. So the question that surfaces from this long history is not whether the medieval world was foolish to trust its inheritance. It was not foolish. It was doing what all-knowing creatures must do. The question is sharper and more personal than that. If the structure of knowledge is transmission, and if transmission carries error as faithfully as truth, then somewhere in the vast inherited picture that the present age carries with such confidence, there are surely Phantom Islands, claims that everyone repeats and no one has tested, errors woven so deeply into the foundation that to doubt them feels like doubting the world. They will not be found by sailing west. They will be found, if at all, the same way the old phantoms were found, by the slow, uncomfortable friction between what has been confidently inherited and what reality, in its own indifferent time, finally insists upon. And until that friction comes, the islands remain on the map, drawn in a steady hand, steady, trusted precisely because they have always been there. Not every phantom was the slow accretion of a legend and copied error. Some were born in a single act, conceived deliberately, and loosed upon the maps of Europe by a mind that knew, or should have known, that it was inventing. The most spectacular of these was a land in the North Atlantic called Frisland, and its story is a study in how a confident fabrication, dressed in the costume of family history and ancestral testimony, could deceive the finest cartographers of an entire era. It entered the record in the middle of the 16th century, when a Venetian nobleman published a narrative, supported by a map, describing the voyages of two of his ancestors who, he claimed, had sailed the northern seas in the late 14th century generations before. According to this account, the brothers had served a great northern lord, had explored islands and coasts in the far north, and had brought back knowledge of lands that no other European had described. The publisher presented the work as a faithful reconstruction assembled from old letters and a decaying map that he said had been damaged by his own carelessness as a child, a detail that conveniently explained any gaps or distortions while lending the whole an air of poignant authenticity. And among the lands the map depicted was Frisland, a large island in the North Atlantic, detailed with coastlines and harbours and place names, sitting in the open sea where no such island has ever been. The deception worked, and it worked at the highest level. The map was taken seriously by the greatest geographers of the age. The masters who were then redrawing the entire picture of the world, the men whose names became synonymous with the science of cartography itself, incorporated Frisland into their own authoritative works. It appeared on the most respected maps and globes of the era, copied and recopied, given the full weight of scholarly endorsement. For roughly a century, Frisland was simply part of the North Atlantic as the learned world understood it, larger than many real islands, more detailed than some real coasts, and entirely completely imaginary. Ships' captains were instructed to watch for it. Geographers debated its position, and all of it traced back to a single published narrative whose evidence no one could examine because the supporting documents were said to be damaged, fragmentary, or lost. What makes Frisland so different from the round island off Ireland or the Saints' drifting paradise is the quality of its origin. The earlier phantoms grew organically from legend, mirage, and the honest confusion of distant report. No one had set out to deceive, but Frisland appears to have been, at least in significant part, a construction. Whether an outright fabrication, an exaggeration of some genuine northern voyage, or a muddle assembled from misread sources, the scholars still dispute. What is clear is that it carried the marks of deliberate authority, the appeal to noble ancestry, the claim of documentary sources, the precise and confident detail. And these were exactly the features that made it so difficult to dislodge. A vague rumour can be doubted, but a detailed account supported by a named family and an apparently ancient map demands to be taken seriously, and the very specificity of the lie was its armour. The more particulars a false account supplies, the more it resembles the texture of genuine testimony, and the harder it becomes to dismiss without seeming to dismiss the careful record of an honest witness. The mechanism of its survival reveals something uncomfortable about how authority and evidence interact. The cartographers who reproduced Frisland did not do so out of stupidity. They did so because they were operating exactly as good scholars should, deferring to a source that presented credible credentials and detailed information, integrating new data into the existing picture. The fabrication exploited the very virtues of the scholarly method, its respect for documented testimony, its willingness to incorporate the reports of credible witnesses, its deference to those who claimed first-hand or ancestral knowledge. A more sceptical age might catch such a thing faster, but skepticism has its own costs, for a mind that doubts every detailed report will also reject many true ones, and the scholars of the 16th century cannot simply be faulted for trusting a well-constructed source. The fabricator understood the rules of the game and played them perfectly. Frisland faded, eventually, the way all the phantoms faded, through the slow friction of failed encounters, as voyages to the northern seas repeatedly failed to find the great island where it was supposed to be, until at last the cartographers quietly let it slip from their maps. But it had enjoyed a full century of existence in the most authoritative geography of its time, and in that century it had confused the understanding of the entire North Atlantic, displacing and distorting real lands, leading expeditions astray, embedding itself so thoroughly that untangling the true northern geography from the false took considerable effort even after the fabrication was suspected. The lesson lingers in the dark like cold air off the sea. The phantom that is most dangerous is not the one born of honest error or innocent legend, but the one that is deliberately fitted with the credentials of truth. The precise detail, the appeal to authority, the documentation that cannot quite be examined. Such a thing slips past the defences of the careful and the learned precisely because it presents itself as the kind of evidence those defences were built to accept. And it raises the most disquieting question of all about the maps of any age, including our own. How much of what is currently accepted on the strength of detailed and authoritative seeming sources is, in truth, a Frisland, a confident construction that has slipped into the record wearing the costume of evidence, repeated by careful people doing exactly what careful people are supposed to do, awaiting only the slow friction of reality to reveal that the island was never there at all? If the edges of the medieval map were guarded by dragons and the western sea was scattered with the islands of the dead, the far north held a different and more peculiar terror, a place where the maps did not merely guess but constructed an elaborate and confident architecture out of pure speculation. At the very top of the world, where the meridians converged and the compass needle behaved in ways that defied understanding, the cartographers of the age of great map-making drew something extraordinary. A vast black rock standing at the exact pole, surrounded by 4 great islands divided by powerful inward-rushing channels, the whole arrangement encircling a colossal whirlpool that swallowed the sea and drew it down into the bowels of the earth. The black rock had a name, and the great cartographer of the 16th century who depicted it placed it at the magnetic heart of the world. It was imagined as a mountain of dark stone, enormously tall, possibly the source of the mysterious force that drew the compass needle ever northward, a physical explanation for magnetism rendered as geography, the unseen cause given a visible and locatable form. Around it the 4 polar islands sat in their fearful symmetry, and between them the ocean poured inward through narrow straits with such violence that no ship once caught in the current could ever escape, the waters spiralling down at last into the central abyss. It was a vision of the pole as a great drain of the world, beautiful and annihilating, and it appeared on serious maps as established geography. The source of this elaborate construction was a lost text, a travel account that the cartographer cited as his authority, supposedly written by an English friar who had journeyed to the far north in the 14th century, and described what he found there. The text itself does not survive in full. It is known mainly through references and summaries, a ghost of a book describing a ghost of a place. The authority for the polar architecture resting on a document that almost no one could actually read, and that may have been as imaginary as the islands it described. And so once again the pattern repeats, a confident geographical claim resting on an inaccessible source, copied forward by careful men who had no way to verify it, and every reason given the authority of the citation to reproduce it. What is so revealing about the black rock at the pole is that it represents the medieval and early modern mind doing something more ambitious than merely recording rumoured lands. Here the cartographers were not just transmitting reports of islands, they were building a theory, an explanation. The compass pointed north. Why? Because the map answered, there stood at the north a mountain of magnetic stone, drawing all needles toward it. The explanation was wrong, but it was not stupid. It was a genuine attempt to account for an observed phenomenon by imagining a physical cause, and in the absence of any better theory of magnetism, a great mountain of lodestone was a reasonable guess. The error lay not in the impulse to explain, but in the willingness to draw the guess onto the map as established fact, to convert a hypothesis into geography, a theory into a coastline. This conversion is one of the most persistent temptations in the history of human knowledge, and it did not end with the age of the Black Rock. There is a deep human discomfort with the gap between a phenomenon and its explanation, and a powerful urge to fill that gap with something concrete, something that can be drawn, named, located, and trusted. The compass pointed north, the gap demanded filling, and into the gap went a magnetic mountain, rendered so vividly and authoritatively that for a time it was simply part of what the world contained. The whirlpool that swallowed the sea served the same function for a different mystery. The question of where the great ocean currents went, the apparent flow of water toward the north, answered again with a concrete and terrible image rather than an honest acknowledgement of ignorance. And the four symmetrical islands betray the hand of the theorizing mind most clearly of all, for their very symmetry is the signature of speculation rather than observation. The real world is rarely so neat. When a coastline is genuinely surveyed, it is irregular, surprising, full of the awkward particularity of the actual. But a coastline that is reasoned into existence, deduced from a theory of how the pole ought to be arranged, tends toward the symmetrical and the elegant, because it is built from ideas rather than from the stubborn messiness of measured fact. The four islands of the pole, balanced and orderly around their central rock, wear their artificiality in their perfection. They are too beautiful to be true, and it is worth remembering that beauty has often been mistaken in the history of thought for a sign of truth, as though the elegance of an idea were evidence of its correspondence to the world, when in fact the most elegant arrangements are frequently the ones the mind has imposed upon a reality that is, in itself, far less obliging. The black rock and its whirlpool were eventually washed from the maps as the real Arctic was approached and found to be neither a drain nor a magnetic mountain, but a frozen and far less symmetrical sea. But the structure of the error endures wherever the mind, confronted with a mystery it cannot yet solve, chooses to fill the gap with a confident and concrete image rather than to sit, uncomfortably, with not knowing. The polar was not understood, and so it was drawn, vividly, authoritatively, wrongly. And the question that drifts down through the cold dark is whether the present age is truly free of this temptation, or whether it too has its black rocks and its swallowing whirlpools, elegant symmetrical explanations for mysteries not yet solved, drawn so confidently onto the map of accepted knowledge that no one quite remembers they began as guesses, awaiting the slow approach of reality to reveal that the pole was never what the map so beautifully claimed. The northern pole was not the only place where a theory hardened into geography. Far to the south, the maps of Europe for centuries carried a landmass so vast that it dwarfed all the phantom islands combined, a continent that no one had ever seen, and that existed entirely because a principle of balance demanded it. It was called the unknown southern land, the great southern continent, and its presence on the maps for so long is perhaps the purest example in all of cartography of a place drawn into existence by pure reasoning, by the conviction that the world must be a certain way, regardless of whether anyone had ever observed it to be so. The argument that summoned it was elegant and ancient. The known world, the inhabited lands of the northern hemisphere, possessed a great weight of continent, the masses of Europe, Asia, and Africa pressing down upon the upper half of the globe. Surely the reasoning went such weight could not be balanced upon a sphere that hung otherwise empty in the south. There must be a corresponding mass in the southern hemisphere to counterpoise it, to keep the world from tumbling, to satisfy the symmetry that a well-ordered cosmos seemed to require. From this principle of balance, this aesthetic and almost moral demand that the world be proportionate, the southern continent was deduced. It was not discovered. It was required. And being required, it was drawn, a great landmass sprawling across the bottom of the maps, given coastlines, given an extent, given the full authority of cartographic ink, all in service of a symmetry that existed only in the minds of those who could not bear an unbalanced world. For centuries, this phantom continent occupied the southern reaches of the most authoritative maps. As real explorers pushed southward and encountered the actual lands of the southern hemisphere, the coastlines they found were often hopefully attached to the imagined continent taken as the long-sought northern edge of the great southern land, each genuine cape and shore pressed into service as evidence for the theory. When a real southern landmass was sighted, it was frequently assumed to be a promontory of the vast continent rather than the modest island or coast it actually was. The theory was so strong that it reshaped the interpretation of real observations, bending the genuine discoveries to fit the imagined whole, a striking demonstration of how a powerful preconception does not merely coexist with evidence, but actively distorts how evidence is read. The continent was finally dissolved not by argument but by sailing. In the 18th century, a methodical navigator drove his ships deep into the Southern Ocean, crossing and recrossing the high latitudes, sailing through the very waters where the great continent was supposed to lie, and found instead open sea, storm, ice, and emptiness where the maps had promised land. Voyage by voyage, the imagined continent was erased, its supposed coastlines revealed as nothing but the conviction of those who had needed the world to be balanced. There was, in the end, a southern landmass, a real continent of ice at the very bottom of the world, but it was far smaller than the phantom, far more remote, and bore no resemblance to the great balancing mass that pure reason had demanded. Reason had been right that something was there, and wrong about nearly everything else, which is perhaps the most treacherous way of all to be partly correct, for a wholly false belief invites refutation, but a belief that is right in its bare conclusion and wrong in all its particulars can absorb almost any amount of contradicting evidence by simply adjusting its details while clinging to its core. The dissolution of the southern continent is one of the great quiet dramas in the history of knowledge, and its lesson is sharper than that of the smaller phantoms. The round island off Ireland was a matter of mistaken sighting and stubborn legend. The great southern continent was a matter of pure deduction, of the mind imposing upon the world a structure that the world had never agreed to. It was wrong not because anyone had misobserved, but because the underlying principle, that the world must be symmetrical, that masses must balance, that the cosmos owes us its proportion, was itself a projection of human expectation onto an indifferent reality. The continent was a phantom of the desire for order, and it took the brute, exhausting labour of sailing through empty seas to dispel it. There is something almost tragic in the centuries the world spent believing in a balance that was never there. Generations of cartographers drew the southern land with confidence. Generations of sailors looked for it. The whole picture of the globe was distorted by the unexamined assumption that the world ought to be tidy. And the assumption was so deep, so natural, so apparently reasonable, that it scarcely felt like an assumption at all. It felt like common sense, like the obvious structure of things, like a truth too self-evident to require testing, which is exactly the disguise that the most powerful errors always wear. So the southern phantom leaves behind a question that does not stay in the southern seas. The mind craves symmetry, balance, proportion, completeness. It is profoundly uncomfortable with a world that is lopsided, arbitrary, unfinished, indifferent to its expectations. And when the mind cannot find the order it craves, it is sorely tempted to draw that order onto the map anyway, to deduce into existence the balance that reality has failed to provide. The great southern continent was such a drawing, a vast, beautiful, reasoned-out lie at the bottom of the world, dissolved at last by the simple, brutal act of going there and finding nothing but the cold sea. And one cannot help but wonder in the dark how many of the present age's certainties are not observations at all, but deductions of the same kind, great symmetrical continents of belief, drawn confidently across the unexplored regions of knowledge, waiting for some future voyage to sail through them and find only open water. It would be a comfort to believe that the age of phantom lands ended with the great voyages of discovery, that once the world had been thoroughly sailed and surveyed, the maps were purged of their ghosts and became, at last, faithful mirrors of the real. But this comfort is false, and the proof of its falseness lies not in some distant medieval archive, but in events near enough to touch, in disputes that have unfolded within living memory, over an island in the Gulf of Mexico that may or may not have existed, and whose disappearance carried consequences far heavier than any medieval phantom ever bore. The island was recorded on maps for centuries, a small landmass in the Gulf, set down by early surveyors and copied faithfully forward into the modern era, appearing on charts and in official records as a fixed and unremarkable point of geography. It had a name and a position, and for generations no one had reason to question it. It was simply there, one small island among the features of the Gulf, as solid on paper as any other, copied from each chart to the next with the unthinking fidelity that the medieval copyists had shown toward the round island off Ireland. And then, in relatively recent times when its position acquired sudden importance, expeditions went to find it and found nothing. Where the maps for centuries had shown an island, the modern searchers, equipped with every instrument of precise navigation, encountered only open water and the featureless surface of the sea. The island was gone, or had never been, or had sunk, or had been misplaced by the original surveyors and copied forward as a phantom for hundreds of years before anyone thought to check. What gave this particular vanishing its peculiar charge was the matter of what its existence or non-existence affected. The position of an island in the Gulf is not merely a curiosity for geographers. Under the modern law of the sea, a nation's maritime territory, its rights to the waters and to whatever lies beneath them, can extend outward from its land masses, and the presence or absence of even a small island can shift the boundaries of those rights across enormous areas of sea. And beneath those particular waters lay things of great value, resources that nations covet. So the disappearance of the island was not a quiet academic footnote. It bore directly on the extent of a nation's claims, on the division of valuable waters, on questions of sovereignty and wealth that have provoked, predictably, a great cloud of suspicion. For where an absence has consequences, there will always rise theories about the absence, and the vanished Gulf Island became the subject of exactly the kind of speculation that surrounds any disappearance that someone might benefit from. Some suggested the island had been deliberately erased, removed from the record by interested parties to shift a boundary in their favour. Others proposed that it had been physically destroyed, eliminated to alter the maritime geography. Still others, more soberly, held that it had simply never existed, that it was an old surveying error faithfully copied for centuries, a Frisland of the Gulf, finally exposed when modern precision went looking and found the sea empty. The truth remains genuinely contested, and that very contestation is the point. The island's status cannot be settled to everyone's satisfaction, and into that gap of uncertainty pour all the familiar human impulses: suspicion, accusation, the conviction that a vanished thing must have been made to vanish by someone with a motive. Set this beside the medieval phantoms and the resonance is striking, but with a dark modern twist. The round island off Ireland vanished from the charts and no one was harmed by its going. It was a ghost of legend and mirage, and its dissolution cost nothing but a fragment of romance. But the modern phantom vanished into a world of laws, boundaries, resources, and rival nations, and so its disappearance became a matter of consequence, of accusation, of possible deliberate erasure. The medieval mapmaker drew his phantom out of legend. The suspicion now is that a modern phantom might have been erased out of interest, that the manipulation of the map, the oldest tool of all for shaping what people believe about the world, might be turned to advantage by those who understand that to control the map is, in a sense, to control the territory. And this is the genuinely unsettling turn, the place where the long history of phantom land sharpens into something with teeth. For most of the story, the phantoms were errors, honest mistakes, inherited legends, theories hardened into geography, the innocent products of how knowledge moves through time. But the moment a map's contents acquire real-world stakes, the possibility arises that the phantoms are no longer innocent, that a land might appear or disappear not through error but through intention, that the map might be edited by those who stand to gain from the editing. The medieval copyist transmitted his island in good faith. But who, in an age where the placement of a coastline can redraw the boundary of a nation's wealth, transmits anything in entirely good faith? The vanished Gulf Island sits, or fails to sit, in waters that several powers regard with interest, its true status perhaps never to be fully resolved, a modern phantom freighted with consequences the medieval ghost never carried. And it leaves behind the coldest question yet to drift through the quiet dark. If a place can vanish from the map when its absence serves someone's purpose, and appear when its presence does, then the map is not merely an imperfect mirror of the world that occasionally carries an innocent error. It is an instrument, one that can be played, and the listener drifting towards sleep might wonder how much of the world as it is currently mapped reflects what is actually there, and how much reflects what someone somewhere found it useful to have the rest of us believe. The suspicion that maps can be manipulated for advantage is unsettling enough, but there is a quieter and in some ways more profound discomfort waiting just beyond it. The realization that even the most modern, most technologically advanced representation of the world, the digital maps that the present age trusts with the unthinking confidence the medievals reserved for their finest charts, still carry phantoms within them, ghosts inherited from older records and reproduced without examination, exactly as the round island was reproduced for 500 years. And the proof of this came not from a dusty archive, but from the open ocean within the present century, when a scientific vessel went looking for an island that appeared on the most authoritative modern maps and digital globes and discovered that it was not there. The island sat in the waters of the South Pacific, a respectable landmass shown on nautical charts going back well over a century, and shown, more strikingly, on the great digital mapping systems that the modern world consults 1 billion times a day, where it appeared as a dark shape against the blue, a clearly marked island in the open sea. By every modern authority it existed. It was on the charts the ships used. It was on the screens that ordinary people scrolled across without a thought. And then a research vessel passing through those waters on a scientific voyage sailed directly to the island's marked position to investigate it, and found the ocean there to be deep open water, with no island, no shoal, no land of any kind, the sea floor lying far below where solid ground should have stood. The island was undiscovered, in the strange phrase the scientists used, removed from existence by the act of going to where it was supposed to be, and finding nothing. The investigation that followed traced the phantom backward through time, and its lineage proved to be precisely the lineage of the medieval ghosts. The island had entered the record long ago, recorded by a passing vessel in the 19th century, set down on a chart and then copied forward, from chart to chart, from the old paper records into the new digital databases, each new system inheriting the data of the old without independently verifying it, exactly as the medieval cartographer inherited his master's coastlines. The error had simply ridden the chain of transmission from the age of sail into the age of the satellite, passing through every technological revolution untouched, because no link in the chain had ever been built to test what it received. Each had been built only to transmit it. The most advanced mapping systems in human history contained a ghost from the era of the wooden ship, and contained it for the simplest of reasons, because the systems before them had contained it, and no one had thought to check. There is a particular vertigo in this that the medieval phantoms never quite induced, for one can hold the round island off Ireland at a comfortable distance, attributing it to the credulity of a less informed age. But the South Pacific phantom belonged to the present, to the very systems that the modern mind regards as the final word on where things are. The systems consulted without a flicker of doubt by navigators, scientists, and ordinary travellers alike. And it had been wrong, confidently and durably wrong, for over a century, its error invisible precisely because the technology was trusted so completely that no one thought to question it. The more authoritative the system, the more thoroughly its phantoms are protected, for authority is exactly what discourages the examination that would expose them. The mechanism, stripped to its essence, is identical across the centuries, and the identity is the lesson. A datum enters the record from some original observation that may have been mistaken. A misreading, a misjudged position, a shoal taken for an island, a cloud bank on the horizon. It is recorded. It is trusted. It is copied forward. Each subsequent system inherits it from the last and reproduces it faithfully, adding its own authority to the accumulating weight, until this datum is embedded so deeply that it has effectively become part of the structure of accepted reality, repeated by everyone, examined by no one. And it remains there, a ghost in the machine, until some accident of circumstance, a ship that happens to sail directly to the spot, a researcher who happens to look, brings the inherited record into direct collision with the physical world, and the phantom, after its long untroubled existence, finally dissolves. What should disturb the listener drifting in the dark is not the particular island, but the principle it exposes, and the principle is general. If the most modern mapping systems can carry undetected a phantom island inherited unexamined from the 19th century, then the comfortable assumption that the present age has finally achieved a faithful representation of the world is not merely optimistic. It is naive in exactly the way the medieval copyist was naive when he trusted that his inherited chart was true. The technology has changed beyond all recognition. The fundamental structure of how knowledge is transmitted, inherited, trusted, copied, rarely tested, has not changed at all. And wherever that structure operates, phantoms can survive, riding the chain from one age to the next, protected by the very confidence that the systems are too advanced to be wrong. So the South Pacific island, undiscovered after more than a century of confident existence, leaves the same question the medieval phantoms left, but now stripped of any consoling distance. The maps of the present are not the faithful mirrors they are assumed to be. They are, like all maps before them, a vast inheritance of accumulated observation, mostly trustworthy, occasionally haunted, carrying forward into the future whatever entered them in the past, true and false alike, awaiting the rare collision with reality that alone can tell the difference. And the listener, scrolling tomorrow across the glowing maps of the world, might pause for the briefest moment over some small island in some distant sea and wonder whether anyone has actually been there, or whether it too is a ghost, patiently waiting, as the round island waited, for someone at last to go and find that it was never there. There remains one final twist in the long story of lands that do not exist, and it is the most human of all, for it concerns not the innocent error, nor the inherited ghost, nor even the manipulated boundary, but the deliberate forgery created to satisfy a hunger. The deep, abiding human hunger for the map to confirm what the heart has already decided to believe. And the most famous example of such a forgery purported to prove a truth that, by a strange irony, turned out to be true after all, though not in the way the forgery claimed, leaving behind a tangle of authentic longing, fraudulent evidence, and genuine history that has never been fully unwound. The object was a map that surfaced in the 20th century, claiming to date from before the Great Westward Crossing that opened the Americas to Europe, and depicting, in its northwestern reaches, a land across the ocean that the Norse were said to have reached centuries before any other Europeans. If genuine, it would have been a document of immense significance, the earliest surviving European depiction of the New World, proof set down in medieval ink that the Norse voyagers had not only reached the western lands, but had recorded them on a map. It was acquired by a great institution, studied, published with considerable fanfare, and presented to the world as authentic, a sensational confirmation that the conventional story of who reached the Americas first was incomplete, and almost immediately the doubts began. Scholars examined the ink, the parchment, the script, the manner of drawing, and over the following decades the evidence accumulated steadily against the map's authenticity. The decisive blow came from chemistry. Analysis of the ink revealed the presence of a compound that did not exist as a manufactured pigment until the 20th century. a substance that could not possibly have been used by a medieval scribe, its presence in the ink as damning as a wristwatch on a Roman statue. The map was a forgery, modern ink laid down on old parchment to manufacture an artifact that history had never produced, and the institution that had championed it was at last compelled to acknowledge what the science had made undeniable. The famous map was a lie. But here the story curls back on itself in a way that no medieval phantom ever did. For the thing the forgery falsely claimed to prove was, in its essential point, actually true. The Norse had reached the western lands centuries before the celebrated crossing. Of this there is now no doubt at all, for the physical remains of a Norse settlement have been excavated on the northern coast of the New World, genuine structures of the right age, containing genuine artifacts, proving beyond argument that the Norse voyagers established a presence in the Americas around the turn of the first millennium, long before the later European arrival. The truth that the forged map was fabricated to demonstrate was, by other and entirely legitimate evidence, a fact. The forger had lied about something real. He had manufactured false evidence for a true conclusion, which is perhaps the most insidious kind of forgery of all, because its fraudulence does not announce itself by claiming something absurd. It claims something that is or might be true, and rides the plausibility of the truth to slip its falsehood past the guard. This is the deepest and most uncomfortable layer in the whole long history of Phantom Lands, the place where the listener, drifting at the edge of sleep, might feel the ground shift beneath the entire enterprise of knowing. For the forged map reveals that the danger is not merely that the world contains errors waiting to be corrected by the truth. The danger is that the human hunger for a particular truth can itself become the engine of deception, that people will manufacture false evidence for the conclusions they have already embraced, and that such fabrications are hardest to detect precisely when they serve a conclusion that is plausible or comforting or independently true. The forger who fabricates evidence for a falsehood will eventually be caught when the falsehood collides with reality. But the forger who fabricates evidence for a truth has built a far more durable lie, for reality will never contradict the conclusion, and only the most careful examination of the evidence itself, the ink, the parchment, the chemistry of the thing, can ever expose the fraud, and the appetite that such forgeries feed has never been confined to the past. The desire to find the map that confirms the cherished belief, the document that proves the thing one already wished to be true, the artifact that vindicates the longed-for story. This desire is permanent, and where there is such desire, there will always be those willing to supply its object, whether through outright fabrication or through the subtler manipulations of selective evidence and confident interpretation. The forged map of the Western lands was exposed by chemistry, by the stubborn refusal of a 20th century pigment to pretend it was medieval. But how many other confirmations of cherished beliefs rest on evidence that has never been subjected to such ruthless scrutiny, accepted instead because they tell us what we already wish to hear? The genuine Norse settlement still lies on its northern shore, real stones in real earth, proof of a true voyage that needed no forgery to support it. And the forged map sits in its institution, exposed at last, a monument to the human willingness to manufacture the evidence for what the heart has already chosen to believe. The two together form the most instructive pairing in the entire story of vanished lands. The true thing that required no lie, and the lie that was told to prove it anyway. And the question they leave behind, drifting down through the dark like the last of the ink fading from old parchment, is the one that ought to trouble the sleep of anyone who has ever been certain of anything. How does one tell the difference between the map that records the world and the map that merely flatters the belief one had already decided to hold, when both, to the trusting eye, look exactly the same? The candle has burned low now over the long catalogue of vanished lands, and what remains is not a conclusion but a kind of quiet vertigo, the sensation of having looked too long at the place where the known world dissolves into the imagined. The round island off Ireland, the refuge of the 7 bishops, the saints' drifting paradise, the cold edge called Thule, the garden at the top of the cathedral map, the magnetic mountain at the pole, the great southern continent demanded by symmetry, the fabricated northern isle, the vanished Gulf Island, the ghost in the digital sea, the forged map of the western shore. They are not, in the end, a collection of curiosities from a less knowing age. They are a single long meditation on the nature of the maps themselves, and on the minds that make them, and on the strange and permanent gap between the world as it is and the world as it has been drawn. For a map was never simply a picture of what is there. It was always also a picture of what its makers believed, hoped, feared, inherited, and could not bear to relinquish. Into the empty spaces of the unknown, the human mind has never been content to draw nothing. It has drawn its legends and its longings, its theories and its terrors, its symmetries and its griefs, and it has drawn them with such confidence, in such steady and beautiful ink, that the line between the observed and the imagined dissolved entirely, leaving phantom and fact indistinguishable on the same trusted sheet. The islands that were never there were not exceptions to the cartographer's art. They were its truest expression, the places where the map revealed most nakedly that it was a creation of the mind as much as a record of the world. And the deepest unease, the one that does not dissipate when the lamp is extinguished, is the recognition that this is not a flaw that belonged to the past and has since been cured. The phantom in the modern digital sea, undiscovered only within the present century, is proof enough that the structure which generated all the old ghosts is operating still. The structure of inheritance and trust, of copying without testing, of confidence in systems too authoritative to question. Every age believes it has finally drawn the true map, that the errors belong to its predecessors and not to itself, that the phantoms have all been erased, and what remains is at last the world as it really is. And every age has been wrong about this, and there is no reason, none at all, to suppose that the present age is the first exception in the whole long history of human map-making. Somewhere in the maps of the present moment, the maps of geography, but also the larger maps, the inherited pictures of how the world is arranged, what is true, what is settled, what every reasonable person knows. There are phantom islands, there are coastlines drawn from legend, continents deduced from a craving for symmetry, fabrications wearing the costume of evidence, ghosts inherited unexamined from older records, and copied forward by careful people doing exactly what careful people are supposed to do. They cannot be identified in advance, for if they could be identified, they would already have been erased. They can only be discovered the way the old phantoms were discovered, through the slow, patient, often accidental collision between what has been confidently drawn and what reality, in its own indifferent time, finally insists upon. And until that collision comes, they remain on the map, trusted precisely because they have always been there. There is perhaps a strange consolation buried in this, alongside the vertigo. The vanished lands were not erased by certainty, but by curiosity, by the willingness of someone to sail to the marked spot and look, to test the inheritance against the world, to risk the discomfort of finding that a cherished island was never there. The round island left the charts not because anyone decided it was false, but because century after century ships kept going to find it and kept returning empty, and the patient accumulation of honest failure finally outweighed the inherited faith. The phantoms dissolve, in the end, not before the proud, but before the curious, not before those who are certain, but before those who are willing to go and see. The correction of the map has always depended on the rare soul who looks at the confident line and asks simply whether anyone has actually been there. It's a humble question, almost childlike, and it has done more to dissolve the great phantoms of history than all the certainty of the learned ever did. For certainty defends the inherited line, while curiosity is willing to sail out and test it against the indifferent sea. So the lands that do not exist anymore are not truly gone. They linger in the archives, in the faded ink of the old charts, in the very structure of how the present age carries its knowledge forward. a permanent reminder that the map is not the world and never was, that every confident representation contains within it the seeds of its own phantoms, that what is most trusted is most protected from the examination that would expose it. The ink fades, the coastlines blur, the islands that ring the Western Ocean with their patient circles sink slowly back into the sea of darkness from which the imagination first summoned them, and the names that were written beside them with such care grow faint until they are only marks, and then only stains, and then nothing at all. The world goes on being whatever it actually is, beneath and beyond every map ever drawn of it, indifferent to the names, indifferent to the harbours, indifferent to the centuries of confident belief, waiting, as it has always waited for someone to set out across the dark water and find, at the marked place on the trusted chart, only the open and silent sea.